In the quiet forests of Minnesota, where the trees stand like silent sentinels, one man's life unraveled into a brutal web of crime, violence, and death. This is a tale of twisted desperation, a transformation from a boy, full of potential, to a ruthless criminal. The story of John Henry Seadlund, a man who became a killer, whose very name would become synonymous with terror, and whose footsteps would forever echo in the history of American crime. John Henry Seadlund was born on July 27, 1910, in the small, quiet town of Fenco, Wisconsin, a place where people knew each other's names, and the world seemed a little less chaotic. But this tranquil setting would be the beginning of a life full of crime, bloodshed, and endless questions. Little did anyone know, the boy who grew up with a fascination for hunting and the outdoors would soon become a name feared across the nation. A name that would forever be tied to violent robberies, prison escapes, and brutal murders. When John was just a child, his family made a move, leaving behind the town of Fenco and settling in Ironton, Minnesota, a town surrounded by the iron mines that had long served as the backbone of the local economy. Ironton was a place where men worked the mines, their hands hardened by labor, and their lives shaped by the land. It was here that John would grow into a young man, and it was here that his love for the outdoors would begin to twist into something darker. John's father, Paul Seadlund, was a respected mechanic in the iron mines, a man who worked tirelessly to provide for his family. But the year 1933 brought tragedy that would change everything. Paul Seadlund was found dead in the family car, his life taken by monoxide poisoning in a freak accident. The loss of his father, so sudden, so unexplained, left a void in John's life, a void that no one, not even the boy himself, could ever truly understand. But what did the death of his father do to the young boy? How did it twist his heart? How did it shape the future criminal, the cold-blooded killer that would soon rise from the ashes of this tragedy? The pain of losing his father would become the first of many influences, guiding him down a path that would be as relentless as the wind through the tall pines of Minnesota. From a young age, John had an undeniable passion for the outdoors. By the time he was 10, he had his first rifle, a .22, and with it, he would spend countless hours hunting in the woods. A boy who learned early on to respect the land, to understand the thrill of the chase, and the satisfaction of bringing home his prey. But there was something else at play. A boy who could be so precise with a rifle, who could strike down a deer from hundreds of yards away. What else could that sharp mind be capable of? John was no stranger to breaking the rules. It was said that he often hunted more ducks than the law allowed, killing as many as 40 in a single trip, though he would always make sure to only bring home the legal limit of 8. The rest? He would stash them in alleys and share them with neighbors. Why? Was it about the thrill of the hunt? Or something deeper? A desire to bend the law, to test his own limits, to push against the boundaries of what was right and wrong. He was a boy with a love for the wild, but also a boy who had learned to manipulate the rules of the world around him. And what do you think happens when a person, especially a young man, learns how to get away with bending those rules again and again? Does it make them stronger? Or does it set them on a course for something darker, something far more dangerous? Could it be that these early moments, his love for the outdoors, his fascination with hunting, his willingness to push boundaries, set the stage for something far more deadly? And if you had been in John's shoes, what would have stopped you from crossing the line between right and wrong? Could it be that, in those early years, a seed of violence had already been planted, just waiting to grow? John's story, like so many others, began with the loss of someone important. His father's death, under mysterious and tragic circumstances, shattered the foundation of his life. But it wasn't just that loss that defined him. It was the world he was now facing, one that would offer him few choices and fewer second chances. As John moved further away from the boy he had once been, he would come to meet the man he would ultimately become. A man who would find comfort in crime, a man who would cross paths with some of the most notorious criminals of his time, and a man who would take his first steps down a path that would lead to bloodshed and death. But before all that, there was a quiet boy with a rifle in his hands, walking the woods of Minnesota. And somewhere in those woods, something was waiting. Something that would change everything. So, what was it that led John Henry Seadlund down this dark path? What could have shaped a boy with such promise into one of the most feared criminals in America? And could it have been his childhood, those innocent hunting trips, that started it all? By 1929, the world as John Seadlund knew it had begun to crumble. The iron mines, which had provided for his family and for the entire town of Ironton, fell victim to the Great Depression. It was a time of desperation, where jobs vanished, hope dwindled, and many men were left with nothing but their hands and their dreams. John, too, was laid off from the mines, a blow that would set in motion a chain of events, steering him far away from the life he had once known. With no work to be found, no money to support his family, John Seadlund didn't just want a better life. He craved something more. A life outside the confines of the empty mines. A life where he could take control. But that desire didn't lead him toward a fresh start. It led him toward something darker. Something dangerous. Something that would change him forever. John Seadlund found himself drawn into a world he had never known before. A world of crime, deception, and ruthless men who didn't care for the law. It was in this world that he would meet a man who would change his life forever. Tommy Carroll, a notorious gangster with connections to the infamous Dillinger Gang. Carroll, a man with ties to the notorious John Dillinger Gang, was no ordinary criminal. He was the kind of man who could convince anyone to do anything. A man with charm, persuasion, and a dangerous aura. And it didn't take long for Seadlund to be pulled into his orbit. But what did Carroll offer him? A chance at something better? Or was it something darker? A chance to truly break free of society's rules and embrace a life of crime. On July 18, 1934, John Seadlund committed his first robbery. The target? The Van restaurant in Brainerd, Minnesota. He walked in, calm and collected, and walked out with $48. It wasn't much, but it didn't matter. For Seadlund, the thrill of the crime was enough. The taste of danger, the rush of taking something that wasn't his, was a feeling unlike anything he had ever experienced before. The law would soon catch up with Seadlund. But even as the authorities closed in, Seadlund wasn't done. No, this was just the beginning. It wasn't enough to steal from a small restaurant. Something darker was waiting. Something more dangerous. Less than 2 weeks after the Van restaurant robbery, Seadlund found himself behind bars. The authorities caught up with him, and he was arrested and held in the Crow Wing County Jail in Brainerd. But the story wasn't over. No, it had only just begun. Seadlund didn't sit idly by while the authorities thought they had him trapped. No, he was far from finished. On July 28, 1934, just 10 days after being arrested, Seadlund made his move. He escaped, quietly, swiftly, with nothing but his wits and the hunger to keep running. He didn't go home. He didn't return to the people who once knew him. No, Seadlund fled into the night, into the unknown. And as the manhunt for him began, one thing became clear. John Henry Seadlund was a man who wouldn't be easily caught. Seadlund's journey took him across the country. From state to state, town to town, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving nothing but a trail of crime behind him. His escape was just the beginning. In the coming months, he would go on to commit his first major crime. A car theft in Memphis, Tennessee. A crime that would set off a chain of even darker, more violent events. By 1935, Seadlund's world had completely changed. He had evolved from a small-time thief to a man capable of stealing cars and crossing state lines. His new crime? Grand theft auto. But this wasn't just about the car. No, this was about setting something much bigger into motion. A chain of events that would lead to more robberies, more violence, and more lives lost. This wasn't a simple car theft. It was a sign of things to come. A warning of the bloodshed, the mayhem, and the terror that would soon follow. Seadlund was just getting started. The first steps into crime were behind him, but now there was no turning back. By 1935, John Seadlund was no longer just a petty thief. No longer a man scrambling to survive in a world that had abandoned him. No, Seadlund had transformed into something far more dangerous. A criminal mastermind, fueled by something darker than desperation. He was now a force of terror, one man against the world. Armed with a .22 rifle and a stolen car, he set off on a rampage across the Midwest. Bank after bank fell victim to his ruthless hands. No longer content with small-time heists, Seadlund began pulling off large-scale robberies. His method was simple: strike fast, strike hard, and vanish into the night before the law could catch up. A shadow in the night, a man no one could predict. It was a game of cat and mouse, and Seadlund was always one step ahead. Seadlund was ruthless. There was no hesitation, no conscience in his actions. With each robbery, he grew bolder. His journey from small-time theft to violent heists was a natural evolution, one marked by bloodshed, fear, and a growing sense of invincibility. The banks he robbed were no longer mere targets, they became trophies. And with each successful heist, Seadlund's arrogance grew. By 1936, Seadlund was a hunted man, a criminal wanted for multiple bank robberies across several states. The nation had begun to feel the weight of his terror. Law enforcement agencies across the country were on high alert, closing in with every passing hour. But Seadlund didn't care. In fact, he welcomed the chase. His madness had overtaken him. He was no longer running for survival. He was running for glory, for the thrill of the hunt. But even as the law closed in, Seadlund wasn't finished. No, there was something far more shocking still to come. In the midst of his criminal spree, Seadlund committed an act that would send shockwaves across the nation. It was the kidnapping of a local cafe owner, a man who had become a symbol of the quiet town Seadlund had once known. His name was James D. Barlow, and he had no idea that his life was about to be forever changed by a ruthless man he had once called a neighbor. Seadlund entered Barlow's cafe, his .22 rifle in hand, and without warning, he seized the man, dragging him out into the cold, dark night. Barlow was taken to a remote cabin, where Seadlund demanded a ransom. But this was no ordinary kidnapping. Seadlund didn't want the money just for survival. He wanted to send a message. His thirst for power had reached its peak, and he was willing to use any means necessary to prove he was untouchable. The ransom demand was set, but the authorities, determined to bring Seadlund to justice, decided to make a dangerous move. They tried to pay the ransom to ensure Barlow's safe return. But Seadlund's madness had clouded his judgment. The deal fell apart. The authorities had set a trap, but Seadlund, in his arrogance, walked right into it. But things didn't go according to plan. In a tragic turn of events, Seadlund's attempt at the ransom exchange was interrupted by law enforcement, leading to a disastrous standoff that would leave people dead, others wounded, and the nation on edge. This failed ransom attempt would be one of the most shocking moments in Seadlund's criminal spree, and it would set the stage for an even more violent confrontation. John Seadlund wasn't just robbing banks anymore. No, something much darker had taken hold of him. His mind, once sharp and driven by the need for survival, was now spiraling into the abyss. Each crime, each violent act, was not just a means to an end. It was a manifestation of his unraveling sanity. Kidnapping, betrayal, murder. These became the new currency of Seadlund's world. A world where only violence could satisfy the cravings that tormented him. It was late 1936 when Seadlund's crimes took a darker turn. He had already left a trail of chaos and fear across the Midwest. But now, there was no line he wouldn't cross. In a chilling act of violence, Seadlund kidnapped Charles Sherman Ross, a man who, like so many others before him, had become just another pawn in Seadlund's twisted game. Ross, unaware of the terror awaiting him, was taken from his home, dragged into Seadlund's dark world. What followed would forever mark Seadlund's descent into madness. What did Seadlund want from Charles Sherman Ross? Was it money, power, or was it simply the thrill of control, of taking another life into his own hands? Whatever the motive, Ross's fate was sealed the moment Seadlund set his sights on him. The kidnapping was just the beginning. The violence that followed would forever define Seadlund's madness. Charles Sherman Ross's life ended that night, just another victim in Seadlund's ever-growing list. But for Seadlund, it wasn't enough. He had tasted the power of life and death, and the hunger for more began to consume him. That same year, in a shocking act of cold-blooded violence, Seadlund killed James Atwood Gray, a man whose only crime was crossing paths with him. No robbery, no ransom, just murder. It wasn't about the money anymore. No, it was about dominance. It was about controlling life and death with a single pull of the trigger. In the end, it wasn't just the money he craved. It was the violence, the ability to determine who would live and who would die. It was an addiction, one that consumed him body and soul. Seadlund's crimes were no longer about escape or survival. They were about proving that he had control over fate itself. But all things, even madness, come to an end. Seadlund's reign of terror had lasted long enough to create a legacy of fear, but it could not last forever. Law enforcement, closing in on every lead, tracking every move, was finally able to corner him in the dead of night. In the winter of 1937, Seadlund was captured. Cornered like the animal he had become, the law had finally caught up to him. But there was no escape, no more running. He had been hunted down, his every move predicted, his every crime catalogued. He was brought to trial, where his fate was sealed, death by execution. On January 12, 1937, John Seadlund was sentenced to death. His reign of terror was over. He had become a symbol of what unchecked madness could do, what the loss of humanity could lead to. He was no longer the boy who loved to hunt in the woods. He was a killer, a man whose descent into madness had cost the lives of many. And now, in the cold, unforgiving depths of the Minnesota woods, he was finally caught. But the question remains, what drove him to this point? Was it the desperation of a broken man? Or was it something far darker? We may never know. July 14, 1938, the day John Seadlund's reign of terror finally came to an end. After years of bloodshed, robberies, and escapes, the man who had haunted the quiet towns of the Midwest was about to meet his grim fate. The courtroom, full of spectators, was silent. The weight of the moment filled the air, thick with the smell of justice and finality. No longer was he the elusive criminal who had evaded the law at every turn. Now, John Seadlund was just another man facing the consequences of his actions. It was here, in the bowels of a cold, silent prison, that John Seadlund would meet the ultimate justice. The electric chair, where his violent, reckless life would come to its horrifying climax. The man who once preyed on the vulnerable, whose hands had taken lives and stolen from the innocent, was now bound to the same fate that had claimed so many before him. John Seadlund's last walk was a quiet one, devoid of the bravado and terror that had defined so many of his crimes. The halls of the prison echoed with the sound of his boots, each step a reminder of how far he had fallen. No longer a feared fugitive, no longer the elusive man who had slipped through the law's grasp time and time again. Now, John Seadlund was simply a man about to face the consequences of the lives he had taken. The trial had been swift, the evidence overwhelming. Seadlund's past, his actions, his brutality, they all led to this one undeniable conclusion. The sentence was clear. His life, filled with violence, lies, and death, would come to an end under the electric lights of the execution chamber. And there, in that moment, all the power he once wielded was stripped away. After his execution, Seadlund's body was sent to rest beside his father's grave, a haunting parallel that not even fate could have predicted. John Henry Seadlund, the boy who loved hunting, the man who had become a criminal, the murderer who had terrorized the Midwest, was buried in the earth, alongside the very man who had shaped his life, both in death and in the choices he made. It was a grim closure for a man who had known no peace. Though Seadlund's journey had ended in the shadow of death, the scars he left behind remained. His name was now a permanent fixture in the annals of American crime. But beyond the headlines and the stories, beyond the tales of robbery and murder, there was the truth of a man who had been shaped by forces beyond his control. A man who had never known anything but chaos, violence, and loss. And so, the story of John Henry Seadlund came to an end. A man whose name will forever be remembered as a symbol of terror, of madness, and of the price one pays when they choose the path of violence. His story will live on as a warning, a reminder that no matter how far we may run, no matter how much we may seek to escape, our choices will always find us. And for John Seadlund, there was no escape, not in life and not even in death. What drives a man to this? What is it that pushes an ordinary person to step into a world of violence and terror? What makes him cross the line from petty theft to cold-blooded killer? John Seadlund's story remains an unsettling testament to the fragility of the human mind, how easily it can be consumed by the shadows. The boy who once roamed these woods, hunting for sport, hunting for life's meaning, became a man who hunted something far darker, a legacy of fear, death, and destruction. Perhaps we'll never fully understand what drove John Seadlund to make the choices he did. Was it his childhood? The loss of his father? The lure of power and violence? Or was it something darker, buried deep within him, waiting for the right moment to surface? One thing is certain. Seadlund's descent into madness was not just a tragedy for him, but for every life he destroyed along the way. And as we look back on the carnage, we must ask ourselves, how much of that darkness was within him all along? Could this happen again? Could there be another like Seadlund out there, waiting, watching, biding his time? Another soul lost to darkness? Another killer hidden behind the mask of normalcy? The answer is both simple and terrifying. Yes, there are always others. For in the quiet corners of our world, behind the facades of everyday life, the shadows still lurk. John Seadlund's story is not just one of crime. It's a reflection of the potential for darkness that resides within us all. It's a reminder of how quickly we can fall, how easily we can lose our humanity. The question remains, are we all just one step away from being lost forever? If you found this story gripping, chilling, and thought-provoking, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true crime stories that uncover the darkness within. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think led John Seadlund down his path of violence? Could something like this happen again in today's world? Let us know and join the conversation